The night was dark, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow up everything in its path. The streets were eerily quiet, with only the faint rustle of wind against the trees breaking the silence. A boy, no older than 12, crept through the shadows, his heart racing in his chest. He wasn't scared of the night. He had grown used to it. It was the mansion ahead that made his pulse quicken. It stood tall and imposing, its dark windows like eyes watching his every move. This mansion, a once proud symbol of wealth, now stood abandoned, yet its silence felt more like a secret waiting to be uncovered. For weeks, the boy had been watching the mansion from the outside. He knew what it held inside, or at least, what he thought it did. Food. Fresh, untouched food, the kind that he could only dream about. Living on the streets had taught him how to survive, how to beg for scraps, and sneak into stores. But this mansion was different. It was a place of opportunity, a place where he could finally get his hands on more than just stale bread or half-eaten sandwiches. The door creaked open as he pushed it, the hinges groaning in protest. His breath caught in his throat, and he held perfectly still, listening for any signs of movement inside. But there was nothing. The house was as silent as the grave. His footsteps were light, calculated, as he ventured deeper into the mansion. Every room he passed was covered in dust, the furniture old and forgotten. It was clear that no one had lived here for years. Yet the air in the mansion felt heavy, thick with secrets and untold stories. He made his way to the kitchen, his eyes scanning the counters for any sign of food. His stomach growled loudly, a reminder of just how desperate he had become. Finally, he spotted it, a pile of canned goods stacked on a shelf in the corner. His fingers trembled as he reached for them, and for a moment, he felt a strange sense of relief. This was it. This was his chance to finally eat, to fill his empty belly. But then as he turned to leave, something stopped him. A sound. Faint at first, but unmistakable. A soft whimper, like the cry of an animal in pain. His blood ran cold. It was coming from the basement. The boy hesitated. He had been taught to avoid places like the basement, especially in abandoned buildings. But this felt different. There was something about that cry, something that made him curious, even though every instinct told him to run. The boy slowly crept toward the basement door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. The sound grew louder, more desperate. He opened the door, and the smell hit him first, damp, musty, the kind of stench you only get in places that have been sealed off for far too long. He descended the creaky stairs, every step echoing through the darkness. The further he went, the stronger the sense of dread grew. And then he saw her. A woman tied to a chair, her face pale and gaunt. Her clothes were torn, and she looked as though she hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. In her arms, wrapped tightly against her chest, was a baby, its small face pale and fragile. The boy's heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs. The woman's eyes flicked up to him, and for a moment, it felt as though the world had stopped. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse and weak. "Help us." The boy's mind raced. Who was she? How had she ended up here, tied up in the dark, with a baby so small and helpless? What kind of person could do something like this? His thoughts swirled in a haze. The sight of the woman and her child, pulling at something deep inside him. But as he took a step closer, something changed. The door behind him slammed shut, and the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Someone else was here, someone who didn't want him to find out the truth. The boy spun around, his pulse racing, but the darkness in the basement seemed to swallow him whole. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Time was running out. He had two choices: run or confront whatever was hiding in the shadows. What would he do next? The boy's heart pounded in his chest as the footsteps grew louder, and a cold chill ran down his spine. He instinctively backed away from the woman, his eyes darting around the dimly lit basement, searching for any escape. The baby in her arms stirred, its tiny hands grasping at the air, and the woman winced, her face contorting in pain as she struggled against the ropes that bound her. The boy wanted to help her, to free her from whatever nightmare she was trapped in, but fear held him still. Who could have done this to her, and why? His mind raced as the shadows around him seemed to grow darker, the oppressive silence threatening to suffocate him. The footsteps were closer now, slow and deliberate, like someone taking their time, savoring the moment. He swallowed hard and looked back at the woman. Her eyes, wide with desperation, met his. "Please," he whispered again, her voice barely a breath. "You have to get out of here. It's not safe. They'll come for you too." The boy's stomach twisted. He didn't understand. Who was she talking about? Who was they? And what kind of danger was he really in? For a moment, he almost turned and ran, but something about her plea held him in place. It was like a thread pulling him toward the truth, toward something far darker than he had ever imagined. He knew he couldn't just leave her there, alone in that cold, dark room. Not when there was a baby involved. As if on cue, the door at the top of the stairs creaked open, and a figure emerged from the shadows. The boy froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in dark clothing. He moved with a purpose, his boots heavy against the wooden floor as he descended into the basement. The boy didn't recognize him, but the man's cold, calculating gaze made his blood run cold. The man's eyes locked onto the boy, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. The tension was palpable, thick in the air, as if the entire basement was holding its breath. The boy's mind raced, his options slipping away like sand through his fingers. Should he run? Should he confront the man? Or should he stay hidden and hope he wouldn't be seen? The man's voice broke the silence, low and menacing. "So we have a visitor, do we?" The boy felt his knees weaken, but he stood his ground. He wasn't about to back down now, not when there was someone who needed him. He glanced at the woman, her eyes wide with fear, and then back at the man. "What are you doing to her?" the boy asked, his voice shaky but determined. "Why is she tied up?" The man smiled, but it wasn't a smile of warmth or amusement. It was the kind of smile that made your skin crawl. "That's none of your concern," he said coldly. "You've made a mistake coming here, kid, and now you'll pay for it." The boy's heart raced. He didn't know what the man meant by that, but the threat in his voice was unmistakable. He had to think quickly. He couldn't afford to make another mistake, not with the woman and her baby's lives on the line. "Please," the woman whimpered, her voice breaking. "You don't know what you're getting into. You don't know who he is. Please just go. It's too late for me, but it's not too late for you." The boy's mind was spinning. Who was this man? Why was he holding her captive? And what did he mean by "it's too late for me"? Before he could ask another question, the man advanced toward the woman, his footsteps heavy and purposeful. "You should have kept your mouth shut," he said, his voice colder now, almost a growl. He reached out, his hand grabbing the woman by the arm and yanking her roughly against the chair. The baby in her arms cried out in distress, a sound that tore at the boy's heart. He couldn't just stand there and do nothing. The boy's mind raced as he stood frozen in the dim light of the basement. The woman's eyes pleaded with him to leave, to escape whatever danger lingered in the shadows. But something inside him told him that if he didn't act now, everything would be lost. The sirens were getting closer, but so was the danger. He could hear the man's heavy footsteps retreating toward the stairs, his shadow barely visible against the flickering light. Without thinking, the boy made up his mind. He couldn't run away now, not when he had come this far. He had to save her. He had to save the baby. It wasn't just about food anymore. It was about doing what was right, about finding a way out for both of them. He darted toward the staircase, his feet scrambling against the worn floorboards. The woman's eyes widened as she watched him move, but her mouth stayed shut. She couldn't speak anymore, not with the ropes so tightly bound around her. The boy reached the top of the stairs just in time to catch sight of the man disappearing into the shadows at the end of the hallway. The boy's heart pounded in his chest as he took a deep breath and followed. His legs felt weak, but his resolve was strong. Every step he took toward the hallway felt heavier than the last, but he couldn't stop now. The mansion was cold, its long empty hallways stretching endlessly in front of him. He moved quickly, his eyes scanning every corner, every doorway. He had to find the man before it was too late. The sound of the sirens had grown louder, but there was no time to wait for help. The boy's fingers trembled, but he kept moving, focused on the task at hand. Finally, he rounded the corner and saw him, the man, standing in front of a large steel door at the end of the hall. The man turned to face him, his eyes flashing with anger and disbelief. "You again," the man snarled. "You just don't know when to give up, do you?" The boy stood there, frozen in place for just a moment. This was it. The man was cornered. The boy had nowhere to go but forward. He took a step closer, his voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. "Let her go," he said. "You're not going to get away with this." The man laughed, the sound harsh and cruel. "You really think you can stop me, kid? You have no idea what you're dealing with." But the boy wasn't listening anymore. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, he lunged forward, his hand grabbing onto the man's sleeve and pulling him away from the door. The man shoved him back with a growl, but the boy held firm, refusing to back down. For a moment, they struggled, both of them fighting for control. The boy's strength wasn't in his size, it was in his determination. And for once, that was enough. With a sharp move, the boy knocked the man to the ground, and the steel door swung open. What lay beyond was worse than he could have ever imagined. It was a dark room filled with locked cages, each one holding more than just abandoned things. There were remnants of lives lost, memories that were never meant to be trapped. The boy's breath caught in his throat as he understood the full extent of the nightmare he had stumbled into. This wasn't just about a woman and her baby. This was something far worse. This was a network of people who had been taken, hidden away, and sold for a price. The boy could barely grasp the truth, but in that moment, he knew it was too big for him to handle alone. And then, just as the man began to stir, the sound of sirens broke through the silence, filling the house with a promise of salvation. The police had arrived. The boy's heart skipped a beat, his body trembling from the rush of emotions that flooded him. The woman and her baby were safe. They were going to make it out of this hellish place. As the police swarmed in, securing the man and his dark operation, the boy stayed in the shadows, watching as everything he had feared and fought against unraveled before him. He had made it just in time. The woman, now free from the ropes that had bound her for so long, hugged her baby tightly against her chest, tears streaming down her face. She turned to the boy, her eyes filled with gratitude and relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The boy only nodded, unsure of what to say. He had never expected this. He had never imagined that one night of hunger would lead him into something so dangerous. But now, standing there in the ruins of what had once been a home, he understood that sometimes doing the right thing came with a price. As the police led the man away in cuffs, the boy felt a sense of calm settle over him. The woman and her baby were safe. The truth had come to light. He had uncovered a secret that needed to be exposed, And in doing so, he had given someone a chance at a future. The boy walked out of the mansion, the cool night air brushing against his face. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if his life would ever be the same again. But for the first time, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The mansion, once filled with darkness and fear, was now a place of justice. The boy's journey had ended, but the story of the woman and her baby, and the lives of those who had been hidden away, would live on. And somewhere deep inside him, he knew that no matter what, he would always remember this night. The night he found courage in the face of fear, and changed the lives of those who needed him the most. The boy glanced back one last time at the mansion, now silent in the distance. He walked away, knowing that his life would never be the same. And in that silence, there was a quiet promise. He would never forget what it meant to fight for what was right.